And I feel that this has been kind of long overdue, and this is a perfect time to do it. So we're going to discuss the Shining series, the series as a whole. Mostly because I did a video on Shining Force Refrain, the demo that came out not too long ago, and I was very critical of it because I felt that it was kind of subpar as an entry in the series. And there was a lot of discussion that on my video, and then also on any other video that I've seen about this game, either the demo or the full release of the game that happened earlier this week, that people don't realize that the Shining series is more than just Shining Force. And so I want to take a minute, and by a minute I mean it's probably going to be a rather lengthy video, to discuss the series as a whole, because the Shining series is a very prolific series for Sega, and there's a lot of, seems to be misunderstanding that if it's not Shining Force, it's not a part of the series, whereas the Shining part of the title is what makes it part of the series. And this series is almost as prolific as the Phantasy Star series. So it just boggles my mind that anyone that says that just because there's Shining in the name doesn't mean it's not a Shining series title, when if you put Phantasy Star in front of something and it doesn't play like any of the previous Phantasy Star titles, either the turn-based RPGs or the MMO style games, that boggles my mind. And it shows that there's a lot of people who really just don't understand the series as a whole is not the tactical RPGs, and there's a lot to this series. So I wanted to take a minute, and again, a lot of minutes, to discuss that. So first off, the history of the Shining series. It started off from an in-house developer called Camelot Software Planning. Prior to that, they were known as Sonic Software Planning, and even prior to that, they were known as just a base development team of Sega CD4. I'm going to refer to them as Camelot because that's a lot easier to deal with from this point onward. So, Camelot started the franchise as Shining in the Darkness, and that came out in 1991 for the Genesis/Mega Drive, and it was actually a first-person dungeon crawler. Not a tactical RPG at all. The series got its start as a dungeon crawler. And that's actually going to be kind of important a little later on once we hit the Saturn era titles. Because one of the big things about the Camelot era games is all of the games are really standalone. They are very unique. You don't have to play one game to understand references to the other. But one of the things that went on over time is Camelot started linking them all together. So places, characters, events started getting re-referenced as games went on. They weren't direct sequels, but it's like, oh yeah, remember that incident that happened in this kingdom, 100 years ago? Things like that started playing into it. So all of the Camelot era games, after the fact, really, started having a lot of interconnectivity. You don't have to play one to get the story of the other, but if you do play them in order of release or in order of how the chronology plays into it, you'll see that there's a lot of things that kind of link back and forth. So, Shining in the Darkness, 1991, dungeon crawler. The next title was Shining Force, came out in 92. That was the first tactical RPG. And that was kind of Sega's response to the Fire Emblem franchise. That was, oh hey, this tactical RPGs seem to be gaining a lot of ground. Let's make our own. This one came out. It was praised for being very vibrant, very colorful, had an interesting soundtrack, a lot of interesting mechanics, but it was also accessible. It wasn't super difficult. A lot of the early Fire Emblem games, you have permadeath. The character dies, they die. Shining Force, character dies, you can resurrect them in town. Not a bad idea. Kind of, tempers the difficulty a little bit. After that, we had two games for the Game Gear, Shining Force Gaiden and Shining Force Sword of Haya. And Gaiden never got released outside of Japan. Sword of Haya did, and they came out in 92 and 93 respectively. Both of these games are tactical RPGs on the Game Gear, so they are very condensed, but still the same tactical gameplay that you found in Shining Force 1. Shining Force 2 came out in '93 for the Genesis/Mega Drive, and it takes everything that the previous title did and then expanded upon it. Whereas in Shining Force 1 you have battle, story, town section, and the town section really is you can go to a shop and buy items, you can go to a church, promote, resurrect, or you can leave. Those are the two things you can do, and you don't get to explore. It's literally you bounce between these three options. It's like a little cursor just kind of goes over them as your party goes to that specific spot. Shining Force 2, however, added insane amounts of exploration. You could explore this giant world. You could go back and revisit places. In fact, that's one of the things you have to do to get all of the recruitable characters in the game, is go back and revisit places. And then the game also wants you to kind of explore around. You go to this fight, oh, you get this item. This item can be used in this particular spot to get a special item. That's part of the story progression. They removed random encounters and made all of the fights more story-oriented. Everything kind of has a purpose to the story. There are random encounter sections where once you've beaten a fight, you can go back and the fights will pop back up there as a means to level up. But for the most part, every fight is story-related. Afterwards, we have Shining Force CD that came out in '94. Now, Shining Force CD was actually the first two Game Gear games remade for the Sega CD using Genesis-style graphics. It also added 2 extra sections of content, so it's 4 books. Book 1 was Gaiden, Book 2 was Sword of Haya, Book 3 was the story wrap-up, and Book 4 was kind of a supreme boss battle. So a lot of extra content, but the bulk of it is retelling the Game Gear games in better graphics. Afterwards, we had Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict, never released outside of Japan. It came out on the Game Gear in '95. There are fan translations available for it. That was the end of the Genesis Game Gear era. After that, we are now hitting the Sega Saturn era, which the first game for that came out in '95, as well as Shining Wisdom. And this is a new entry in the series with completely new gameplay. Shining Wisdom is a Zelda clone, and I said this in my Let's Play, and a lot of people got antsy about it, and I stick with Zelda clone because there's a lot of Zelda mechanics and Zelda-style gameplay of the action RPG. In fact, Working Designs, the company that localized it, has action RPG on the front cover of the game. You get a lot of dungeon exploration to have puzzle sections where the item you get in said dungeon is the key to completing said dungeon. You get the health upgrades, much like the heart orbs, or heart containers in Zelda. There's a lot of parallels between Shining Wisdom and Zelda, so I stick with Zelda clone. But that's the first time the series has had anything other than a dungeon crawler or tactical RPG. And in fact, by this point in time, the tactical RPGs outnumber everything else, because you only have the other 2 games. The next game in the series, Shining the Holy Ark, came out in '96 for the Sega Saturn, and this marks the series' return to a first-person dungeon crawler. Shining the Holy Ark is really important because it kind of comes back to the beginning of the series. Same type of gameplay, and this was Camelot kind of exploring a lot of different options. They had already done, I believe at this point they'd already done Beyond the Beyond on PlayStation 1, and this is also kind of the setup for the Golden Sun series that they do for Nintendo, because you have a lot of mechanics that carry over in terms of how combat works with special power attacks, and that if you see how the characters get power attacks in Shining the Holy Ark, you see that that was an idea that they took and greatly expanded on for the Golden Sun games. And then the 4-character combat setup kind of brings over, but it's not, Golden Sun's not first person. But there's a lot of ideas in Shining the Holy Ark that you can see get greatly refined for Golden Sun. So, but it's also the Shining series return to the dungeon crawler. Next, we have 97, Shining Force 3 Scenario 1. This is the last game done by Camelot to be released in North America. And there was a huge issue with this because of how Sega was trying to get away from the Saturn so that they could start focusing on the Dreamcast. Shining Force 3 was 3 scenarios and then a bonus disc, each being a full-length game. The fact that Scenario 1 was the only one localized and Scenarios 2 and 3 were kind of rushed, that is the final nail in the coffin for the working relationship between Sega and Camelot. After Sega said that only Scenario 1 was going to be released, Camelot said, we'll finish everything else, and if you're not going to release it, we're going to go. And they did. So Scenarios 2, 3, and the Premium Disc were never officially released in North America. There is a fantastic fan translation that I was very honored to be a part of, being able to kind of live test one of the translation revisions. And thanks to those wonderful people, I was able to play the game in its entirety, because really the game is the same story from 2 different perspectives, and then the completion of the story, the events carry over. Everything, it's kind of what you saw in Shining Force CD, where it's 2 games and then the conclusion of the story and then an epic boss battle. They took that and expanded upon that as well. Now, a lot of the interactions between a lot of these things, Shining Wisdom, there are characters from Shining Force 2 of Sarah the elf and Kazan the elf. They were kind of edited in the North American version because Working Designs didn't have the rights to use the names for whatever reason, so they had to be changed. But there's a lot of connection between the villain from Shining Wisdom knowing one of the villains from Shining Force 2. There's a lot of trying to connect those 2 games together. Shining the Holy Ark really is the beginning of Shining Force 3. So many characters from Shining the Holy Ark and so many plot points carry over and are the direct plot line of Shining Force 3. Between the fight between the Vandals and the Innovators, the Vandal named Galm, the High Priest, there are a lot of story connections. Specifically, one of the main characters, the hero for Scenario 3, and one of the heroes that appears in Scenarios 2 and 3, Julian, is the son of a character that was in Shining the Holy Ark. You encounter him as a child, and you hear about the tragic tale of his past in Shining Force 3. So there's a lot of direct connections. From this point on in the series, because it's not... everything here is kind of listed as the post-Camelot era. Here we have Shining Soul, came out in 2002, and Shining Soul 2 that came out in 2003. These were kind of action RPGs done in a Diablo-esque style. They were kind of 3/4 top-down dungeon explorer type games for the Game Boy Advance that had multiplayer, which was a huge thing at the time. Then you had Shining Force Resurrection of Dark Dragon, which was a remake of Shining Force 1 with a revised story script, new battles, new characters, and a bunch of new mechanics, from a card collecting minigame to battle rewards for completing the battles in X number of turns or less. Then we had Shining Tears in 2004 for the PS2, and this marks the start of the Tony Taka games. Tony Taka being the character designer for the series, basically this point on for any of the newer titles. He is known in Japan for his specific art style, mostly because prior to this he did mostly hentai. So the characters kind of have a lot of hentai influenced elements, and well, we'll just leave it at that. Shining Tears being a kind of refined Shining Soul, the action RPG hack and slash genre. We had Shining Force Neo, which this game is what kind of started souring North American fans on the franchise, because Shining Force Neo is not a tactical RPG. Prior to this, any Shining Force game was a tactical RPG. Shining Force Neo, not tactical at all. It is a hack and slash action-adventure game, much like Shining Tears and Soul. And that's where people started getting kind of about it, and where the series started tanking in North America. Then there were several games to come out on the mobile phone market in Japan: Shining Road to the Force, Shining Force Chronicle 1, Shining Force Chronicle 2, Shining Road, Priestess of the Dark Dragon, and Shining Force Chronicle 3. Road to the Force was a tactical RPG that was not a remake, made for mobile phones. Chronicle was a remake of Shining Force Gaiden, Chronicle 2 was a remake of Shining Force Sword of Haya, and Chronicle 3 was a remake of Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict. And Priestess of the Dark Dragon has no information on it. I've never actually heard of this game. And those span from 2005 to 2012. Yeah, so those are the mobile phone games. We go back to 2007 for Shining Force EXA, which was the last game released in North America. And came out on the PS2. Again, Shining Force title, not a tactical RPG. This is where fans of the series started getting a little upset. It's like the series was on a downward spiral in North America. Japan thought that it was just not being well received because fans of the series were too stuck on the Camelot-style games, not giving the newer style games a chance. And the director of the series at this point got really confrontational with Western fans, saying that these games aren't for Western fans. These games are for Japanese fans, and if we don't like it, we don't get to have the games. And that's what kind of marked the end of it. And there was a campaign done by a fan community saying to save the series. We would like to get the chance to play these games. These games we feel are just kind of what can... And the campaign was not well received in Japan. It was seen as insulting, and that further soured relations between North American fans of the Shining series and Sega of Japan, who seemed to just refuse to localize titles. So, continuing on, we had Shining Wind on the PlayStation 2. It was a follow-up to Shining Tears. The designs were again done by Tony Taka. You had Shining Force EXA Mobile, which was a mobile version of Shining Force EXA. You had Shining Wind X, which was an enhanced version of Shining Wind on phones. You had Shining Force Feather. Now, this was the series' return to a Force game that was a tactical RPG, but it was not a grid-based tactical RPG. It had area, radius of movement, and there was an interesting combo system. Being done on the DS, we were expecting this game to come out in North America because the DS was super popular in North America, but no, it was passed over for localization. Presumably, again, because the series was still being directed by the director, and there was still a lot of animosity between that director and North American fans. And that was 2009. So, also in 2009, you had Shining Force Cross, which was an arcade title. I believe that was a fighting game. I'm not 100% sure. The arcade games I've found very little information on. Mostly because North America doesn't have a lot of arcades, and we don't get a lot of the large arcade machines. After that, saw the PSP era games, which was Shining Hearts, Shining Blade, Shining Arc. All three of these done by Tony Taka. These games were kind of strategy RPG in the vein that Valkyria Chronicles is a strategy RPG. It had that same third-person over-the-shoulder camera angle of characters, and there was limited range of movements. There was a lot of things for this that you could see kind of became either became or was influenced by the Valkyria Chronicles franchise when that started. Shining Hearts was December of 2010. Shining Blade was 2012. Shining Arc was 2013. And again, none of these games got localized in North America. But it was kind of a mix between the action style and the tactical styles. Then you had Blade Arcus from Shining, which was, that one definitely was a fighting game. It was done on arcades, and that one did get a Windows release. I believe that one actually got released in North America as well on Steam. If not one of the, it may be the sequel, Blade Arcus from Shining EX, because that's just a title you want to have, right? That seems ridiculous. So Blade Arcus was arcade and Windows. I believe that one was actually released in North America. That one was released in North America to very little fanfare because it was a fighting game, and it was all of the characters from the franchise that were never localized, the parts of the franchise that were never localized. So a lot of North American fans were like, okay, there's a Shining fighting game with characters that we have no frame of reference for, we have no attachments for, because we've never played the games that they've come from. The only thing about them is they were designed by Tony Taka. That's the only thing that we know. Then we have Shining Resonance that came out on the PS3 in 2014, which also, again, designed by Tony Taka, never got a release outside of Japan. Are we sensing a theme here? Then you have Blade Arcus from Shining EX, Blade Arcus from Shining Battle Arena. Battle Arena also has a Windows release, so that one may be the one that got released in North America. And Blade Arcus Shining EX was PS3, PS4, not released outside of Japan. And now we have Shining Resonance Refrain that came out July 10th, 2018. And it's an enhanced version of Shining Resonance on the PS3 and has an extra game mode where you play as other characters. And it's the first game in the franchise to be released in North America that is not a fighting game and released on consoles. Because again, the Blade Arcus was only released on Steam. It was not released on consoles. And this being a kind of RPG-esque, it plays very much like the Tales series or the Star Ocean series, but much slower and much less fluid because it's not action-style combat. It's action movement, but an AP gauge of combat. So you can only perform so many combos before you have to recharge your gauge. So it is still very RPG-esque. But, again, I was kind of critical of it because it felt, to me, a little subpar. Mostly because I haven't gotten a chance to play any of the games that were not released in North America, aside from Shining Force 3, the fan-translated scenarios. I have not gotten a chance to play the PSP-style games, which bothers me because I've been saying for years that I feel that the Shining series would do really well with a Valkyria-style engine, and those games are kind of it, and we never got a chance to play those in North America. So, yeah, the series itself has a huge number of titles and a huge degree of variation between titles. You've got 3D tactical style games, you've got grid-based tactical style games, you've got dungeon crawlers, you've got action RPGs, you've got hack and slash. You've got a lot of variation between these games. And so, when a lot of people say that a Shining game is not Shining Force, yes, it's not Shining Force. And even some of the Shining Force games are not what people are expecting from a Shining Force game. But the series itself has a lot more entries than just the grid-based tactical RPGs. So, I would like a lot of people to realize the Shining series, as a whole, is a very large series. I can't even remember how many titles I have just, nailed through their release dates and discussion about what type of game they are. It is a ridiculously prolific franchise for Sega. So, if a Shining game comes out from Sega, it is just assumed that it is going to be part of the Shining series. Much like if a Phantasy Star game came out from Sega, regardless if it is Phantasy Star Kart Racing, it has that name. And that name is what kind of links it to the other games. Even if there's no other connection whatsoever. Obviously, you know, Shining Arc has a very similar title to Shining the Holy Arc. There are no connections between those games, but they are still both part of the Shining series, because they're Shining games. Even if they weren't done by the same company, they're both done by the same development team. They are done by the same company. They're both done by Sega, meant to be part of the Shining series. That's kind of how the franchise works. And this is a franchise that has not really required to stick within a particular genre. Much like the Final Fantasy games are all kind of turn-based or action RPGs these days, with notable exceptions being like Final Fantasy Tactics, but even then, the Final Fantasy name and a lot of the Final Fantasy elements remain. This series really throws a lot of things left and right, but wanting to take the series and kind of take the name and use the name to kind of expand on something else that people may not have bought. Because there's a good chance that a lot of these titles in the Shining series, had they been named something else, may not have actually gotten the sales or recognition that they got, simply because they didn't have the Shining name attached to them. So it was, early on, when it was Camelot trying to say, we have a series, but we want to experiment with new ideas, but we want to kind of build upon, you know, the world or the story and the style that we had before, and have that give people a chance to give this new idea a try. So, yeah, that's the Shining series really in a nutshell. There are so many things about the Shining series, trivia-wise, that I want to look up and I want to do follow-ups on, because the series itself is just, there's a huge amount of history behind it. Like I said, there was a lot of animosity between Camelot and Sega because of the switch to the Saturn to the Dreamcast, and that working relationship was soured. There's so much history there with just that part of the franchise. And then there's, you know, so many titles past that there's a huge history, especially with like the Save Our Series campaign and how the director took that and the animosity back and forth. There's so much history with this franchise that I'm already sitting at about a half hour, and there's so much more to the series. So I really hope from this point on, anyone who sees a Shining game by Sega doesn't automatically assume that it's going to be a tactical RPG, even if it's got Shining Force in the title. I really hope Sega goes back to that. And it's like, keep the Force games tactical, either grid-based or 3D or whatever, and then have other Shining games to be elsewise. Hello, Kitty. You are making things difficult. But I really hope Sega could stick with that. But even if they don't, I hope people can take a look at the Shining series as a series and say, okay, this is a Shining game, this is an action RPG, or this is a dungeon crawler, or this is even a fighting game at this point, and be like, okay, it's part of the series, let's take a look at it as a part of the series and go from there, rather than it's not a Shining Force title, it's not part of the series, or it just automatically sucks. Because, again, I think Shining Resonance Refrain, it's not a bad game, I just feel that it's not... It's just subpar. It is a mediocre action RPG, and the problem is I've got too many games to settle for mediocre when, you know, disposable income is a thing. But that doesn't mean I don't wish the series well, and doesn't mean I don't wish the series to continue. It just means that this particular title, not really my cup of tea. Maybe if they continue, I'd be interested in giving the series, you know, another shot. Or maybe if this one, I can get it for a bargain, I might pick up. I don't know. It's hard to say. But there is a lot to this franchise, and I really hope people just stop instantly going, it's not a Shining Force game, therefore it's not a Shining game, therefore it has no connection. This game may have very few connections to any of the other Shining games, but it is a Shining game. It's done by Sega. The character designs are Tony Taka, who's been doing it since the PS2 era. It's part of the same franchise, folks. Long and short. So, I'm going to end this before I ramble any longer, because this has been a long video. Like I said, there was no way I was going to be able to do this in a condensed fashion. So, I hope you have enjoyed this very condensed rundown of the Shining series. If you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Or if there's any information that you know of the Shining series that is neat trivia, tidbits, history, whatever, please feel free to add to it. Because, again, this is a very long-running series with a lot of history behind it, and a lot of people just don't seem to know the history because they've played the Genesis games, and that's kind of it. So, yeah. I will see you in the next discussion video I do, depending on if it's Shining related or not. Who knows? So till then, later everyone.